Welcome to the Putback, presented by 888 Sport. Bet $20 on either the Knicks or the Nets and get $88 in free bets by entering the promo code SNY88. I'm Ian Begley here with Chris Williamson. Chris, what do we have for the baseline?
A big loss for the Knicks over the weekend as center Mitchell Robinson fractured his right foot against the Milwaukee Bucks. And on Monday, the team announced that he had successful surgery to repair that fractured right foot. And just a very, very tough loss for New York.
Just a brutal blow, right, for the Knicks, Chris, and for Mitchell Robinson. Obviously, for Robinson, it's his second fracture this year. Fractured his hand, now he's fractured his foot, and you just feel bad for a young player who's suffering those kind of injuries in such an important season. You think with the Knicks, they should be able to kind of hold the fort down because Nerlens Noel did really well as their starting center when Robinson was out for several weeks with that hand fracture. So you would expect between Nerlens Noel, Taj Gibson, that they'll be able to, bridge the gap here. But the other interesting thing is the Knicks with Andre Drummond, he was out there. He was a free agent. Knicks were rumored to be interested. I had heard all along that there wasn't like a majority of Knicks decision makers interested in Drummond, but there was a couple key voices in that organization that had interest in Drummond. Ultimately, they had cooled on Drummond, and part of the idea was because they wanted to see Mitchell Robinson in this starting role for the rest of the regular season to get a chance to evaluate him, just have more information on Robinson.
And Ian, looking back on what Mitch did, a couple of years ago, where he sets the all-time field goal percentage record to now where his shooting is going down 8.3 points per game, but his rebound going up. What are your takeaways from this season right now for him?
If you're looking for Mitchell Robinson to come in and take this leap in year 3 on the offensive end, you're disappointed. But I think if you had more of a realistic expectation maybe, then you feel like that Robinson met that bar because he was the same Mitchell Robinson, if not better, on defense. I thought that he improved his foul rate. The offense, there was no expansion of his game. He certainly didn't start shooting jump shots or shooting anything from the perimeter yet.
Taking all of that into account, what are the chances that the Knicks look for a long-term extension with Mitchell Robinson?
With this Knick regime, right? Leon Rose and his group, you probably want to see a little more from Robinson before you start to commit long-term money in an extension situation. They have the opportunity to extend him this offseason. I know they thought about it last offseason. I think it was more so based on the idea of them spending a bunch of cap space last offseason, committing big long-term money on other guys, and then locking Mitch up. But that opportunity is still there. I don't know if they've seen enough to be ready to make that commitment. They could also just pick up his option, and then he will be a restricted free agent the following offseason. So a lot of interesting decisions for the Knicks to make about Mitchell Robinson while he rehabs this injury.
We just kind of have this opportunity to grow as a flower inside of whatever it is. If we're in the tulip bed, that's something entirely different than if we're in the petunia bed. I was in the cactus bed, so to speak, probably.
Okay, so Lonzo Ball, I'm saying the Knicks need to go all in. Why? Because he's a solid point guard. His scoring has drastically improved. Not only that, but he's good for plenty of assists. He has no problem getting his teammates involved. And another thing that I like, we didn't have to trade for him, which means you don't have to give up any pieces you don't want to. So Ian, I want to know, do the Knicks go after Lonzo Ball in the offseason?
Ashley, I spoke to someone with knowledge of the Knicks-Pelicans Lonzo Ball trade talks, and they expected the Knicks to re-engage on Ball in the offseason. Now, Ball is going to be a restricted free agent. The Knicks will have significant cap space so they can make Ball an aggressive offer in restricted free agency. And obviously, they'll be looking for a point guard. But the one question that came up among the Knicks internally was, is Ball the right point guard for the future for us? I don't think that everybody is settled on that idea, but I would expect the Knicks to at least be in touch with Ball in the offseason. I know that Ball is not the only point guard on the Knicks radar when you talk about that offseason, so I don't think it's Ball or nothing for the Knicks this offseason, but I think he will be on their radar once we get to early August.
I've always kind of had that Maverick kind of brand. That's unbranded, by the way. Maverick is unbranded cattle. So that's where that word comes from. So I've kind of been unbranded my whole life.
And what?
And Ian, a lot of news and rumors swirling about the Knicks assistant coaches and potentially them taking head coaching jobs in college basketball. And Mike Woodson is going back to his alma mater.
Everybody in that Knicks organization is first class, and I have them to thank for me standing here today.
But you wrote the story on Saturday about Kenny Payne staying in New York.
Yeah, that was big, I think, for the Knicks because with Kenny Payne, he had a strong relationship with the AD over at DePaul, Dwayne Peavy. They worked together in Kentucky. So it was like this foregone conclusion that Kenny Payne was going to go to DePaul. So the idea that he decided to stay in New York is encouraging for the organization because Payne has played a really big role in obviously the development of the Knicks this year and the way they've played. And I think he could play a big role for them in the future. And also the Utah Utes had some interest in bringing in Johnny Bryant, the Knicks associate head coach, and to coach that college program. It didn't come to fruition, but the idea that they were interested is an encouraging sign. You wouldn't want teams not calling you when these jobs open up, not calling you for permission to interview your assistants, but the idea that these assistants are getting the interest, getting the phone calls, getting far along in the process, and even in the case of Mike Woodson getting hired, I think it speaks to the quality of the staff that has been put together here. It speaks to the idea that Leon Rose, Tom Thibodeau, everybody did a good job in putting a staff together. And it also speaks to the idea that this staff could really help this group and whoever they bring in. And I think if you're a Knicks fan, you're happy for Mike Woodson because he's getting a job, his dream job, going back to his alma mater, Indiana, after he did a good job coaching the Knicks. It was an unceremonious exit, and here he gets another opportunity.
Chicken scared me when I went out there. It's tough to pick those eggs off when you're 6 years old and your aunt sends you out there and they're like pecking your hand while you're trying to get eggs.
So those were actual quotes from Phil Jackson on the Curious Leader podcast last week. But let's focus on the basketball side of things. Ian, what were your 5 biggest takeaways from Phil's look back at his Knicks tenure? Let's start with number 5.
Yeah, so number 5, Chris, for me is the media. And I think only the media really cares about what Phil has to say about us. But I thought it was interesting because it was the first thing Phil brought up when he started talking about the Knicks. And let's be clear, this podcast was not about the Knicks. It wasn't Phil talking about his tenure on the media. He talked about like stuff that had happened before he got here. Larry Brown, Isaiah Thomas, Anuka Brown-Sanders referenced the media being against the team. And I wish he'd gotten into more specifics because maybe he's talking about the tabloids. I don't know. All I can say is for me, Larry Brown stuff, Isaiah Thomas stuff, that never entered my mind at all when I was covering Phil Jackson's Knicks. And I would also say that if they had won, the coverage would have reflected that. It would have been very positive. I mean, look at 2012, 2013, the Knicks were a playoff team, coverage was positive.
All right, so what about number 4?
Yeah, I would go Derek Fisher. Phil touched on it briefly, but he talked about what went wrong with Fisher. He referenced the situation with Matt Barnes that he said became, I don't want to quote him, I'm paraphrasing, was a distraction. There, to me, is where things started to really go sideways for Phil, because that was his first big decision. The first time you hire a coach, you have to get that right if you're an exec. We saw that it didn't go well. I actually thought Fisher, the team was playing pretty well when Fisher got fired in year 2, but that's neither here nor there. That to me was the start of this thing going sideways for Phil.
And what about number 3?
3, the fans. I mean, he touched on it so briefly at the end, but he started to talk about how the fans were a factor in what went wrong. I wish that there was a follow-up question. He cut it off, and I wish he let Phil kind of go on and talk more about the fans, because once you start critiquing your own fan base, that you're never going to win that fight. I wish I got to hear more about Phil's thinking on that.
Well, number 2.
2, I would go Carmelo. He talked about Carmelo, not being the leader that he had wanted him to be. And the interesting thing, though, that I thought was Phil talking about the no trade clause in the contract that Carmelo signed with the Knicks in 2014, and he had said that the no trade clause was signed with the understanding that if Phil said, hey, it's time for you to go, it's time to make a trade here, Carmelo would then give him a list of teams and they would work something out. And he made it seem as if Carmelo was unwilling to waive that no trade clause. And to me, that's a miscalculation on Phil Jackson's part, because you have to understand that there's a possibility that Carmelo will not waive the no trade clause if you give it to him, regardless of what's said during that negotiation when everybody's happy in 2014. So you got to think a few steps ahead about the possibility that it's not going to work out the way you think it is before you grant him that no trade clause. and that ended up, hampering things for everybody involved with the Knicks.
What about number one?
Number one, I am going with the triangle, and this to me was so interesting because it wasn't said when Phil was talking about the Knicks, but he made a reference to the triangle offense when he was talking to Kobe Carl. And as a quick aside, Phil Jackson, what happened with the Knicks takes nothing away from his resume as a coach. One of the most brilliant coaches in basketball history, incredibly decorated, successful. So no one can question his credibility as a coach. We're just talking about the Knicks here. But he talked about the idea that the principles of his offense were relatable to today's game. But he said that there was things about the triangle that do not relate to today's game because penetration in today's game is done through the dribble and the pick and roll. And also, you can't commit 2-3 offensive rebounders to go attack the rim because it creates an imbalance in the defense. All along through Phil's tenure, it was triangle. Like he wanted the Knicks to play a triangle offense. It rubbed players the wrong way. It rubbed coaches the wrong way. So this was one of the underlying factors of why this thing didn't work in New York. And it's so interesting to me to hear Phil now say the triangle isn't suited for today's NBA. If he had come to that realization during his time with the Knicks, maybe things could have gone differently. For Chris, I'm Ian. We'll see you next week on the Putback, presented by 888 Sport.
So, what do you think the Knicks should do with Mitchell Robinson after this season? That's the subject of this week's SNY Fan Choice presented by 888 Sport. Bet $20 on the Knicks or Nets and get $88 in free bets with promo code SNY88.